Hey YouTube, Tech Freckle here again. Today we're going to go over the fundamentals of CSS and then go right from this into learning CSS selectors and visual rules. Let's get started. Introduction, Fundamentals of CSS. In this unit, you will be introduced to the fundamentals of CSS. The goal of this unit is to introduce you to CSS, one of the languages essential to developing websites. You will learn how to apply styles to HTML documents using CSS. After this unit, you will be able to understand how CSS is used for web development, use CSS to build initial styling to your website, understand the box model in CSS, add positioning using CSS, read CSS documentation, CSS. All right, let's get right into it. So this is the selectors and visual style or visual rules. Intro. While HTML is the fundamental structure of every web page, it can be visually unappealing on its own. Cascading style sheets or CSS is a language web developers use to style the HTML content on a web page. If you're interested in modifying colors, font types, font sizes, images, element positioning, and more, CSS is the tool for the job. In this lesson, you'll learn how to set up your CSS file structure and select which HTML elements you wish to style. Take a look at the code in index.html and observe how it displays in the browser to the right. This is plain HTML without any styling. Let's take a quick look at the power of CSS. Copy and paste the following code onto line 5. What happens when you press the run button? Take some time to explore and experiment with the code in the style.css file. All right, let's take a quick peek. Looks like CSS. All right, CSS anatomy. Diagram to the right shows two different methods of syntaxes for writing CSS code. The first syntax shows CSS applied as a rule set, while the second shows it written as an inline style. Two different methods of writing CSS may seem a bit intimidating at first, but it's not as bad as it looks. Both methods contain common features in their anatomy. Notice how both syntaxes contain a declaration. Declarations are the core of CSS. They apply a style to the selected element. Here, the P element has been selected in both syntaxes, will be styled to display the text in blue. Okay. Understanding that a declaration is used to style a selected element is key to learning how to style HTML documents with CSS. The terms below explain each of the labels in the diagram to the right. Rule set terms. Selector at the beginning of the rule set used to target the element that will be styled. Declaration block. The code in between and including the curly braces that contains the CSS declarations. The declaration, the group name for a property and value pair that applies to a style or applies a style to a selected element. Okay. Property, the first part of the declaration that signifies what visual characteristic of the element is to be modified. Value, the second part of the declaration that signifies the value of the property. All right. Inline style terms, opening tag, the start of an HTML element. This is the element that will be styled. Attribute, the style attribute is used to add CSS inline styles to an HTML element. Declaration, the group name for a property and value pair that applies a style to the selected element. Property, the first part of the declaration that signifies what visual characteristic of the element is to be modified. Value, the second part of the declaration that signifies the value of the property. All right, don't worry about memorizing all of these. You'll get acquainted with them more and more as the course progresses. Feel free to come back and use this exercise as a reference later on. Study the diagrams to become familiar with the CSS syntax and the new terms that will be used throughout the course. Click the next button when you're ready to write some code. All right. Inline styles. Although CSS is a different language than HTML, it's possible to write CSS code directly with HTML code using inline styles. To style an HTML element, you can add the style attribute directly to the opening tag. After you add the attribute, you can set it equal to the CSS styles you like applied to that element. The code in the example above demonstrates how to use inline styling. The paragraph element has a style attribute with its opening tag. Next, the style attribute is set equal to the color red, which will set the color of the paragraph text to red within the browser. If you like to add more than one style with inline styles, simply keep adding to the style attribute. Make sure to end the styles with a semicolon. It's important to know The inline styles are a quick way of directing or directly styling an HTML element, but are rarely used when creating websites. We may encounter circumstances where inline styling is necessary, so understanding how it works and recognizing it in HTML code is good knowledge to have. Soon you'll learn the proper way to add CSS code. In index HTML, use inline styling to set the color of the first paragraph, the first P element, to green. So this one. Internal style sheet. As previously stated, inline styles are not the best way to style HTML elements. If you wanted to style, for example, multiple H1 elements, you'd have to add inline styling to each element manually. In addition, you would also have to maintain the HTML code when additional H1 elements are added. Fortunately, HTML allows you to write CSS code in its own dedicated section with a style element nested inside of the head element. The CSS code inside the style element is often referred to as internal style sheet. An internal style sheet has certain benefits and use cases over inline styles, but once again, it's not best practice. We'll get there, we promise. Understanding how to use internal style sheets is nonetheless helpful knowledge to have. To create an internal style sheet, a style element must be placed inside of the head element. After adding the opening and closing style tags in the head section, you can begin writing CSS code. Okay. CSS code in the example above changes the color of all paragraph text to red and also changes the size of the text to 20 pixels. Note how the syntax of CSS code match for the most part. The syntax you used for inline styling, the main difference is that you can specify which elements to apply the styling. Okay. Let's move the inline style that we added to the paragraph into an internal style sheet. Start by adding an empty style element in the head of index HTML. Okay. Didn't finish that. It's weird. Must nearly be like a built-in thing. Okay. Boom. Inside of the style element, add a CSS rule set targeting paragraph element. You can leave the declaration block empty for now. Okay. Next, place just the declaration from the inline style into the empty declaration block. So I'm going to get rid of this. So, oh no, I'm just going to go color. Oh, it wants the full declaration. Okay. My bad. Finally, delete the inline style from the PL. Okay, I've already done that. Notice how the styling works the same in the style sheet as it did in the inline style. Okay, cool. External style sheets. Developers avoid mixing code by storing HTML and CSS code in separate files. HTML files contain only HTML code and CSS files contain only CSS code. You can create an external style sheet by using the CSS file name extension like so, style.css. With an external style sheet, you can write all the CSS code needed to style a page without sacrificing the readability and maintainability of your HTML file. Take a look at index.html, cut the CSS code rule set in between the opening and closing. Boom. And press the run button. The font changes didn't take effect. Click the next button to find out why. Yes, what did I do wrong here? Got rid of the style. Take a look at the index. Cut the CSS code rule set between the opening and, oh. Delete the remaining style element, now empty. Button. I can't click. Why is it? Take a look at the index.html. Cut the CSS code rule set in between the opening and closing style. Okay. Did you remove the rule? Oh, what? Cut the paste it directly Okay, my bad. Did not read it. All right, linking the CSS file. Perfect. We successfully separated structure HTML from styling CSS, but the web page still looks bland. Why? When HTML and CSS codes are in separate files, the files must be linked. Otherwise, the HTML file won't be able to locate the CSS code, and the styling will not be applied. You can use the link element to link HTML and CSS files together. The link element must be placed within the head of the HTML file. It is a self-closing tag and requires the following attributes. href, like the anchor element, the value of this attribute must be the address or path to the CSS file. Rel, this attribute describes the relationship between the HTML file and the CSS file. Because you're linking to a style sheet, the value should be set to style sheet. When linking an HTML file and a CSS file together, the link element will look like the following: link href rel style sheet. Note that in the example above, the path to the style sheet is a URL. Okay. Specifying the path to the style sheet using a URL is one way of linking a style sheet. If this CSS file is stored in the same directory as your HTML file, then you can specify a relative path of URL like so. Using relative path is a very common way of linking a style sheet. Let's link the style sheet to the HTML file. So style CSS. Oh, next. The other lines attribute and set it to the correct value. Keep an eye on the first paragraph's font. It should appear different from the destination's description when your style sheet is linked correctly. That it does. Review. Great work so far. By understanding how to incorporate CSS code into your HTML file, as well as learning some of the key terms, you're on your way to creating spectacular websites with HTML and CSS. Let's review what you learned so far. The basic anatomy of CSS, syntax written for both inline styles and style sheets, some commonly used CSS terms such as rule set, selector, and declaration. CSS inline styles can be written inside the opening HTML using the style attribute. Inline styles can be used to style HTML, but it's not the best practice. An internal style sheet is written using the style element inside the head element of an HTML file. Internal style sheets can be used to style HTML, but are not best practice. An external style sheet separates CSS code from HTML by using the CSS file extension. External style sheets are the best approach when it comes to using HTML and CSS. External style sheets are linked to HTML using the link element. Take this knowledge to the next lesson where you start learning how to select HTML elements to style. Here are more resources to add to your toolkit. All right. Remember that declarations are a fundamental part of CSS because they apply a style to a selected element. But how do you decide which elements will get the style? With a selector. A selector is used to target the specific HTML elements to be styled by the declaration. One selector you may already be familiar with is the type selector. Just like its name suggests, the type selector matches the type of the element in the HTML document. In the previous lesson, you changed the color of a paragraph element. This is an instance of using the type selector. The element type is P, which comes from the HTML P element. Some important notes on the type selector. The type selector does not include the angle brackets. Since element types are often referred to by their opening tag name, the type selector is sometimes referred to as the tag name or element selector. Open the styles CSS on line 5. Add a rule set using the type selector to target all H1 elements and leave the declaration block empty. Okay. Inside the curly braces of the H1 Add the declaration below. Note that the content of the web page will update because we've already linked the styles.css to index. Right. Universal. You learned how to type the selector selects an you learned how the type selector selects all elements of a given type, while the universal selector selects all elements of any type. Targeting all of the elements on the page has a few specific use cases, such as resetting default browser styling or selecting all children of a parent element. Don't worry if you don't understand the use cases right now. We will get to them later on in our Learn CSS journey. The universal selector to use the star character in the same place where you specify the type selector in a rule set like so. In the code above, every text element on the page will have its font changed to Verdana. To see how the universal style selector targets all elements on a page, copy the rule set below and paste it onto the first line of the style CSS. Then click Run. Holy crap. Okay, since the universal selector targets all elements, every element on the page now has a red border. Not a visually pleasing look, but you can see how all elements have been modified. All right, let's learn how to undo that. Class is not limited to selecting elements by their type. As you know, HTML elements can also give attributes. When working with HTML and CSS, a class attribute is one of the most common ways to select an element. For example, consider the following. P class equals brand sole shoe company. Paragraph element in the example above has a class attribute with the opening tag of P element. The class attribute is set to brand. To select this element using CSS, we can create a rule set with a class selector of .brand. To select an HTML element by its class using CSS, a period must be appended to the class's name in the example above. The class is brand, so the CSS selector for it is .brand. On line 11 of index HTML, there's an H1 element with the class title. Okay, now open style CSS. On line 13, use the class selector to create a rule set that selects the HTML using the class title. Okay. Inside the curly braces of title selector, add the declaration, color teal. This code will change the color of the H1 with the title class to teal. We'll see in a later exercise why using the .title overrides the H1 selector. Okay. Multiple classes. We can use CSS to select an HTML element's class attribute by name. And so far we've selected elements using only one class name per element. If every HTML element has a single class, all style information for each element would require a new class. Luckily, it's possible to add more than one class name to an HTML element's class attribute. For instance, perhaps there's a heading element that needs to be green and bold. You could write two CSS rule sets like so. .green, .bold. Okay. Then you could include both of these classes on one HTML element like this. We can add multiple classes to an HTML element's class attribute by separating them with a space. This enables us to mix and match CSS classes to create many unique styles without writing a custom class for every style combination needed. Index.html on line 11, there's an H1 element with the class of title. Add a second class named uppercase to this element. Next, navigate to the style CSS and add a rule set using the .uppercase selector, then add the declaration below inside of the curly brackets. Okay. Boom. Okay. ID. Oftentimes, it's important to select a single element with CSS to give it its own unique style. If an HTML element needs to be styled uniquely, we can give it an ID using the ID attribute. In contrast to class, which accepts multiple values and can be used broadly throughout an HTML document, an element's ID can only have a single value and can only be used once per page. to select an element's ID. With CSS, we prepend the ID name with a number sign. For instance, if we wanted to select the HTML element in the example above, it would look like this. The ID name is large title, therefore the CSS selector for it is large title. Okay, on the line 11 of index HTML inside the H1 opening tag, and after the class attribute had an ID with the value article title. Okay, style CSS, add a rule set using the ID selector to target article title. And font family cursive. Okay, you'll see the change to a cursive font, bringing some beauty and elegance to the page. Okay, maybe not so much, but the font does change. All right. Attribute. You may remember that some HTML elements use attributes to add extra detail or functionality to the element. Some familiar attributes may be href and source, but there are many more, including class and ID. The attribute selector can be used to target HTML elements that already contain attributes. Elements of the same type can be targeted differently by their attribute or attribute value. This alleviates the need to add new code like the class or ID attributes. Attributes can be selected similar to types, classes, and IDs. Basic syntax is an attribute surrounded by square brackets. In the example above, href would target all elements with an href attribute and set the color to magenta. And it can get more granular from there by adding type and or attribute values. One way is by using type and then attribute value. In short, this code selects an element where the attribute contains any instance of the specified value. Let's take a look at an example. Image source, cold, winter, warm, summer. The HTML code above renders two image elements, each containing a source attribute with a value equaling a link to an image file. So if the image source, I'm assuming this if it contains winter, it contains summer. Okay. Now take a look at this. Above CSS code, the attribute selector is used to target each image individually. The first rule set looks for an image element with an attribute of source that contains the string winter and sets the height to 50 pixels. All right, and does the same, but 100 pixels. Notice how no new HTML markup like class or ID needed to be added, and we were still able to modify the styles of each image independently. This is one advantage to using the attribute selector. To use the attribute selector to select the A element with an href attribute value containing Florence, add the following code to the style CSS. Okay, notice how only the learn more link in the Florence Italy paragraph changed to light green. Okay. Next, in style CSS, use the attribute selector to select the A element. That is an href. So I'm going to copy this. Oops, I did not want learning assistant. And we're going to go Beijing. And we'll change it to light blue. And finally use the attribute selector to change the A element with an href. Okay, so light pink. Pseudo class. You may have observed how the appearance of certain elements can change or be in a different state after certain user interactions. For instance, when you click on an input element and a blue border is added showing that it is in focus. When you click on a blue A link to visit to another page, but when you return, the link's text is purple. When you're filling out a form and submit button is grayed out and disabled, when all the fields have been filled out, the button has color showing that it's active. These are all examples of pseudo class selectors in action. In fact, focus, visited, disabled, and active are all pseudo classes. Factors such as user interaction, site navigation, and position in the document tree can all give elements a different state with pseudo class. A pseudo class can be attached to any selector. It is always written as a colon followed by a name. For example, p-hover. Okay. In the above code, whenever the mouse hovers over a paragraph element, that paragraph will have a lime colored background. Add a rule set to the end of the CSS that selects A elements on the page Okay. Add the hover pseudo class to the A selector. And then color dark orange. When you hover over the learn more text, the font color changes to dark orange. And does it apply to all of them? Yes, it does. Okay. Classes and IDs. CSS can select HTML elements by their type, class, and ID. CSS classes and IDs have different purposes, which can affect which one you use to style HTML elements. CSS classes are meant to be reused over many elements. By writing CSS classes, you can style elements in a variety of ways by mixing classes. For instance, imagine a page with two headlines. One headline needs to be bolded blue and the other needs to be bolded green. Instead of writing separate CSS rules for each headline that repeat each other's code, it's better to write a bold CSS rule, a green CSS rule, and a blue CSS rule. Then you can give one headline the bold green classes and the other the bold blue classes. While classes are meant to be used many times, an ID is meant to style only one element. As you'll learn in the next exercise, IDs override the styles of types and classes. Since IDs override these styles, they should be used sparingly and only on elements that need to always appear the same. To demonstrate using classes on multiple elements, let's give a few elements the same style in index.html. There are 4 H2 elements. Give each of them a class of heading background. Okay, so here's the first one. There are 4, it says. Okay. Now let's give a unique style to a single element using ID. On line 13, there's an H6 element that displays the time the article on the page was published. Add an ID attribute. Publish time. Okay, then in style CSS, create a rule set. Targeting the new heading. Give it a declaration. Okay, which one was, this one's class. ID, okay, so what heading background. Declaration of background color aqua. Boom. After you press run, notice how all of the H2 elements now have the same style. Okay, this heading background class can continue to be applied to any element you wish to bestow that amazing style onto. Finally, in style CSS, create another rule set. On. There we go. Using the publish. This one. Is that not right? That should be right. Publish time. Color gray. Okay. Specificity. Specificity is the order by which the browser decides which CSS styles will be displayed. A best practice in CSS is to style elements while using the lowest degree of specificity so that if an element needs a new style, it is easy to override. IDs are the most specific selector in CSS, followed by classes, and finally type. For example, consider the following. Okay. In the example code above, the color of the heading would be set to firebrick, as the class selector is more specific than the type selector. If an ID attribute and selector were added to the code above, the styles within the ID selector's body would override all other styles for the heading. Over time, as files grow with code, many elements may have IDs, which can make CSS difficult to edit, since a new, more specific style must be created to change the style of an element. To make styles easy to edit, it's best to style with a type selector if possible. If not, add a class selector. If that is not specific enough, then consider using an ID selector. Okay. To compare type, class, and ID specificity, let's add a class and ID to an existing element. On line 12 of index, there's an H5 element. Give the element a class, author class, and an ID, author ID. The element now has 3 ways of selecting it: by type, class, and ID. Add the 3 following rule sets to the bottom of style CSS. Each of these rule sets selects the same element in a different way. Which style will win the specificity war? Click Run to find out. Because ID is the most specific selector, the element will change to cornflower blue. You may have noticed the other H5 elements change to yellow. This is because the most specific and only selector they have is their type. Chaining. When writing CSS rules, it's possible to require an HTML element to have 2 or more CSS selectors at the same time. This is done by combining multiple selectors, which we will refer to as chaining. For instance, if there was a special class for H1 elements, the CSS would look like below. H1.special. The code above would select only the H1 elements with a class of special. If a P element also had a class of special, the rule in the example would not style the paragraph. Let's use chaining to select only the H2 elements with destinations and add a style to them. In style.css, write a CSS selector for H2 elements with a class of destination. Okay, inside the curly braces, add this declaration. So we'll go font family Tahoma. So we'll change the font of the H2 elements that also have the class destination. The last HTML elements, more destinations will remain unchanged. Okay. Descendant combinator. In addition to chaining selectors to select elements, CSS also supports selecting elements that are nested within other HTML elements, also known as descendants. For instance, consider the following HTML. The nested list elements are descendants of the UL element and can be selected with the descendant combinator like so. Dot main list li. In the example above, the dot main list selects the element with the main list class, the UL element. The descendant LIs are selected by adding to the L or to the selector, separated by a space. This results in the main list LI as the final selector. Selecting elements in this way can make our selectors even more specific by making sure they appear in the context we expect. In index.html, each destination has a paragraph with a description class below it. Nested within each description paragraph is an H5 element with the text top attractions. They're a little hard to read since they turned yellow. Let's fix that. Navigate to Style CSS, add a rule set that uses the descendant combinator to target only the H5 descendants of elements with the class description. So description H5. Color violet. Chaining and specificity. In the last exercise, instead of selecting all H5 elements, you selected only the H5 elements nested inside the dot description elements. This CSS selector was more specific than writing only H5, adding more than one tag, class, or ID to a class selector increases the specificity of the CSS selector. For instance, consider the following CSS. P, main P, red. Okay, both of these CSS rules define what a P element should look like. Since main P has a class and P type as its selector, only the P elements inside the dot main element will appear red. This occurs despite there being another more general rule that states P elements should be blue. To show how specificity increases with additional selectors, let's create another rule set with the descendant combinator and compare it to the rule set without. So style CSS, write a rule set using the descendant combinator to select the H4 elements nested in the LI elements inside of the curly braces. So this should be H4. I'm assuming that this is what this will look like. Color gold. Did you put the H4 after LI? Yes. So it should not look like that. Really? It's very odd. Now create a rule set targeting elements with just the H4 type and add a declaration. Blue. Will the H4 elements turn blue? Click run to find out. Elements stay gold. Oh, these ones. Okay. Because there's a more specific selector for H4 elements you wrote in the last step. Because of the more specific CSS selector, LI-H4, the more general selector of H4 will not take hold. Right. Multiple selectors. In order to make CSS more concise, it's possible to add CSS styles to multiple CSS selectors all at once. This prevents writing repetitive code. For instance, the following code has repetitive style attributes. H1. Okay, so instead of writing font family Georgia twice for two selectors, we can separate the selectors by a comma to apply the same style to both like this. So H1 and menu, font family. By separating the CSS selectors with a comma, but the H1 elements and the elements with the menu class will receive the font family Georgia styling. In the CSS, write selectors for the H1 and LI elements. They both will be styled with the same CSS rule. So review. Throughout this lesson, you learned how to select HTML elements with CSS and apply styles to them. Let's review what you learned. CSS can select HTML elements by type, class, ID, and attribute. All elements can be selected using the universal selector. An element can have different states using the pseudo class selector. Multiple CSS classes can be applied to one HTML element. Classes can be reusable, while IDs can only be used once. IDs are more specific than classes, and classes are more specific than type. That means IDs will override any styles from a class, and classes will override any styles from a type selector. Multiple selectors can be chained together to select an element. This raises the specificity, but can be necessary. Nested elements can be selected by separating selectors with a space. Multiple unrelated selectors can receive the same styles by separating the selector names with commas. Great work with this lesson. With this knowledge, you'll be able to use CSS to change the look and feel of websites to make them look great. Take some time to take in the beauty of the site you just created and feel free to continue when you're ready. Wow, what a beautiful site. All right, let's do this quiz. What is the correct syntax to style multiple unrelated selectors? What is the most specific selector in the code below? Should be sidebar because that's an ID. What does the style HTML tag allow? It links external CSS files to the HTML document. It is the only way to apply styles inside an HTML file. It automatically adds common styles to your web page, writing one or more CSS rules and CSS syntax inside an HTML file. What is the correct syntax to select an element inside another element? Oh, fuck that up. What is the correct syntax to select an element inside another element? Yeah. Following code attempts to style a paragraph using the style tag, but it fails to do so. Why? Style, because okay, this is like, the hell? The style attribute of the P element can be removed because the style tag replaces it. The color attribute must be changed to color. The contents of the style tag must be not HTML code. The P will not appear at all. Following HTML code attempts to use inline styling to change the color of the paragraph text, but fails to do so. Why? Color attribute must be changed to style. Color attribute is valid. It should be changed to style and then set the color red. So this P style equals color red. This one. What is the purpose of the HTML link tag when it comes to styling a page? What is the main difference between inline styles and the style tag? Inline styles allow you to write CSS in a separate file. No. Style tags allow you to write CSS in no. Inline styles directly modify individual HTML elements using a style attribute, whereas the style tag allows you to write CSS. Boom. Complete the link code below to link a CSS file called main CSS to an HTML file. So this is style sheet link href main CSS. Which of the following statements is correct? IDs are more. Okay, which of the following best describes the concept of CSS selector specificity? All right, specificity refers to how a browser decides which styles to display when there are multiple styles defined that could apply to the same element. Specificity refers in the order in which HTML elements appear in the browser. Specificity refers to how descriptively you write your class or ID names. First, whether you style multiple selectors to the same. Separating HTML and CSS into their own files helps accomplish which of the following? Boom. Which one was it that we got wrong? This one. What is the correct syntax to select an element inside another element? Is this changing a class selector to an element type selector? And CSS allows for selecting elements of that specified type that also have the given class. In this case, main list li targets elements inside elements with the main list class, correctly selecting an element inside another element. Okay. Leave the next lesson for the next video. We'll see you there.